Welcome back to Ye Olde Guide, your podcast guide to the history and heritage of the towns and cities of England. Last time, back in episode 9, we visited Lincoln. For episode 10, we'll be visiting another famous city, beginning with L, with a castle, hilly terrain, and with a World War II bomber named after it. But this time on the other side of England, up in the northwest. We are, of course, visiting Lancaster, a city whose name will be familiar to many listeners. This podcast is brought to you by, well, me, Liam McGrath, and the Duke of Urban History, Daniel Gooch. Welcome back to the show, Daniel. And spring has sprung in England, so there's no better time to be visiting Lancaster. What did you make of our visit?
Well, I don't want to give too much away. I was very excited to go. It's I think, new ground for the podcast, our first visit to the Northwest. As you said, Lancaster is a name that has huge historical resonance. So, yeah, I think it was a really exciting trip for us, and we'll see soon how we enjoyed it.
Certainly was. We had a very good time, and we made it to nearby Morecambe as well, which was great fun. And for those of you not familiar with this part of the world, you'll find Lancaster at the north end of Lancashire in the sort of northwest of England. And it's right on the main transport artery between England and Scotland. So it's just off the M6 and the West Coast main line on the rail network. So it's really easy to reach, and it's almost joined on to Morecambe, which is a pleasant sandy seaside resort. We'll go there for an episode in the future, I'm sure. It's not far away from the Lake District, so it's one of those places you can visit, and there's a lot to see. In this episode, we're going to focus on Lancaster, and we'll be exploring the city in 5 categories. For our own amusement, in each of those categories, we will be giving scores for historical impact and how that impact can be understood in a visit to that city. We've got more details about this on the website, yeoldeguide.com, a bit more details on the scoring, what we've scored other cities we've visited, and links to our previous episodes. Just to mix things up, in this episode, if you're a regular listener, you'll notice we've changed the order of the categories, just for a bit of a change. So Lancaster, as I've said, is in the northwest. It's a small city. It's only about 60,000 population, and yet its name is extremely well known. Tell us a bit about its ancient origins to begin with.
The origins of Lancaster really as a Roman fort, so it goes back a very long way, and traces of those fortifications do remain. The exact name of the fort isn't known, but it's possible the city gets its name from this. In the Domesday Book, it's called Lancaster, Lom meaning river loon, and Castor meaning the Old English for fort, from the Latin castrum, as in kind of Manchester, Colchester, other Roman founded cities you found across England. Lancaster probably remained inhabited once the Romans left, and it stood kind of on the border between 2 Saxon kingdoms. Mercia and Northumbria may have had a monastery around this time, but the town's importance was certainly reduced hugely by later Danish invasions, and one of the largest Viking hordes found in Britain, the Silverdale Horde, was found quite close to Lancaster. A Saxon church was built within the city walls, though, for sure, and Lancaster Castle and the adjacent priory, which are still there today, were founded in Lancaster in the 11th century. Moving further on in the Middle Ages, Lancaster retained its port, which was founded by the Romans initially, and associated trade, but as with many urban settlements, it suffered hugely during the Black Death, losing half its population in the 1340s. Did grow prosperous in the industrial age through the trade that was carried on through its port, which went through a real resurgence and at one point was one of the busiest in the whole country. But the town still remained quite small. As you said, the population is very small today. And while the population of most industrialised northern cities really shot up in the 19th century, even the smaller towns and cities, Lancaster's only increased by about 50% from 1801 up to 1870, which is very, very low compared with most towns of similar size and importance.
Yeah, especially in that area as well, in Lancashire. That's where the highest growth settlements were, you know, Manchester, but even Preston and Rochdale and those kind of mill towns exploded in size more so than Lancaster.
Absolutely. But even when you go into the south of England, established towns like where I'm sitting now, Reading, its population shot up many, many times in the 19th century, even though you don't think of it as a huge industrialised town. So, yeah, it was pretty low growth during the 19th century. Moving on to the 20th century, it became a city in 1937. And today it's the county town of Lancashire. I think the administrative seat is actually in Preston, so it's kind of county town in name. But it still retains some significance in as much as it gives its name to the county of Lancashire.
And it's now become just a very pleasant 20th century city with, a great legacy of historic buildings, but also a modern university. It feels like quite a wealthy modern city.
Well, there's a very high student population, and as I think we'll see in kind of the art and culture section later, and as we experienced when we were there, I think that does have some influence on the feel of the town.
Great.
Or city, okay. I should say. I should correct myself on that.
It is 1937. 1937. Brilliant. Right, well, that was a great overview, Daniel. Let's now get into the categories. Well, our first category is politics and war, and really, we have to start with the House of Lancaster. Now, first of all, can you explain to me what is the Duchy of Lancaster? I've heard of it, but tell us a bit about what it actually is.
The Duchy of Lancaster today is the private estate of the monarch. The monarch is always the Duke of Lancaster, hence the Queen today is the Duke of Lancaster, specifically the Duke, not the Duchess. The Duchy is a hugely wealthy landowner. It owns Lancaster Castle, various areas nearby on the Lancashire shore, but really its holdings are spread out everywhere, including estates across the country, and its headquarters are in London, in fact, not in Lancaster. But I suppose if you want to understand how the Duchy of Lancaster came about, you probably have to go back to what many people will know Lancaster for, the House of Lancaster. Mm-hmm. Because I think many people's first mental historical connection with Lancaster is going to be that famous medieval dynasty that fought the Wars of the Roses against the House of York. Lancaster gave its name to the dynasty not because it was a central seat of power or really somewhere where great battles took place throughout the wars, but because the founder of the House of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, married the heiress to the Duchy of Lancaster and became himself the Duke of Lancaster. Hence, his descendants are characterised today as fighting under that title, the House of Lancaster. The Duchy was actually merged with the crown under Henry V. So ever since then, the Duchy has been in the private hands of the monarch. I think on this, we probably shouldn't overstate too much the role of the city of Lancaster itself in the Wars of the Roses or its connection to the Crown Estates, because, as I've hinted at, it's kind of the symbolic centre of the Duchy of Lancaster rather than a real centre of political power. As I mentioned, the Duchy of Lancaster's headquarters is actually in London, but it certainly gives, this real historic connotation to the city's name today.
So does the Queen, or the Duke of Lancaster, it's very odd she's called the Duke of Lancaster, but yeah, we'll let that go. Does she spend any time in Lancaster?
I know several monarchs have visited Lancaster. It's basically slap bang in the centre of the British Isles, and it's always been on that main road up to Scotland. The Queen herself, I'm sure she's visited at some point. She's been around in her time, but
it didn't have the sort of battles. Or during the Wars of the Roses, didn't have this. Was it the centre of sort of conflict?
Not in the Wars of the Roses. No, I don't think there's any evidence of major battles there. But there have been other battles in Lancaster we can talk about. I think what's interesting about Lancaster is, as we've said, it's right up in the far north of England, and for a long time it was one of the major cities in that region. Pretty much the only area you could call urban in a very rural area for a long time. So it's had quite an important role in kind of Anglo-Scottish relations, for want of a better word. And since some action in skirmishes between the two countries, the first one we can talk about is when the town and castle were pretty badly damaged during the First Scottish War of Independence in 1322. This was Robert the Bruce's so-called Great Raid of 1322, which was an attack on northern England by his forces. It started around Carlisle, just over the border into England. It penetrated all the way down to Yorkshire, and there was really significant destruction. Lots of theft of valuables, cattle, and even people, because, like many historical figures, Robert wasn't quite the unimpeachable moral figure that you see him become in Braveheart. Yeah. Moving on from then, the town was destroyed. It suffered heavy damage again by Scottish forces in 1389.
Yeah.
during more border skirmishes between Scottish and English forces. But moving on from there, you can then come to the Jacobite rebellions, when descendants of the Catholic James II, who was ousted from power in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which you might remember we spoke about quite a lot in our Reading episode.
Episode 2.
That's it, one of my favourites. Essentially, he tried to reclaim the English throne with substantially Scottish support. First, in 1715, the forces of James's son, the old Pretender, also called James, occupied the town, which led to 4 rebels being beheaded there. And then second, in 1745, when James's grandson, Bonnie Prince Charlie, very famous name, occupied the town very briefly and was supposedly very warmly welcomed. You might remember in the Market Square, Liam, that plaque on an old pub which said he was proclaimed regent on that site in 1745. So really Lancaster's kind of location just over the border on a main travel route down to the south of England has led to it playing some role in these Anglo-Scottish skirmishes in the past.
And whose horseshoe was it that was in a street?
That was supposedly John of Gaunt's.
Okay.
The founder of the House of Lancaster.
So you can find that in the centre of Lancaster. Well, that's brilliant. And what about the Civil War? We always have to mention the Civil War.
We only have time for a brief mention because there was some action there. The town initially joined the Royalist side at the beginning of the Civil War, but it was captured by parliamentarians in 1643. The Royalists did attempt to retake it later that year, but they only managed to capture the town and not the castle. If you recall in the Lincoln episode, we drew that distinction between the defensible castle at the top of the hill and the city at the bottom of the hill. And the two were almost kind of separate entities during warfare. One you could capture, the other you couldn't. It's probably helpful to think of it in similar terms for Lancaster. There's not quite such a dramatic distinction between the castle on the hill and the town at the bottom, but it is still there.
Okay, is there anything else we should bring up in politics and war?
It's probably fair to talk about Lancaster's Roman heritage, because it was a fairly important Roman settlement. I think the Romans probably settled there, it's thought, so they could establish a secure crossing over the River Lune. And the town was actually pretty well connected. It was connected by road as far as Warrington to the south on the Cheshire-Lancashire border. There are a few remains of the ruined Roman fort on Castle Hill. The fort has its origins in the original wooden fort that was built in 80 AD. Some of the fort's buildings probably went under the present site of Lancaster Castle, because that's certainly a good defensive location to build a defensive structure on top of a hill.
Yeah.
The fort was actually abandoned at the end of the 1st century AD, but it was reoccupied in the next century and rebuilt then in stone. It went through various subsequent periods of abandonment until it was extended, and finally, it's believed, was occupied right up to the 5th century AD Roman abandonment of Britain. So really, the settlement of Lancaster, with a few periods of abandonment, lasted right from the very beginning to the very end of Roman Britain.
But when we visited, as you say, there was some Roman buildings on Castle Hill, and there was artefacts in the City Museum, but there wasn't a huge amount of Roman feeling to the city. It's not like when we were in Colchester or Chester. It's much smaller, but there are things you can see for an insight into that Roman period. Yeah,
there were the remains of the bathhouse is one thing we looked at. The Roman bathhouse was built on the side of the location of the fort. It's probably from an external building that was demolished in the 4th century to allow further building work on the fort. And in the museum, one thing I really liked was the Lancaster Roman tombstone, if you remember that.
Yeah, it's
a little bit gruesome, actually. It shows a mounted Roman soldier with a beheaded enemy at his feet. So it's quite powerful, actually, when you look at it, quite dramatic.
Yeah, it's well worth seeing, well worth popping into that museum, actually. Okay, then let's go on to the scoring.
On battles, it's probably fair to say there were no major pitched battles like we might have seen in say, the Reading episode. No major turning points in any wars that arose from battles in Lancaster like we saw in our last episode on Lincoln. I do still think the Anglo-Scottish stuff is pretty interesting, and it shows you just how important a city Lancaster was on a regional level throughout much of its history. On politics, there's less to say directly. The city's name alone, as we've said, is certainly enigmatic of important events and eras in British history. And Lancaster, as we said earlier, remains, at least on paper, the county town of Lancashire, so has some regional significance. I think you touched on something earlier. There isn't much of a Roman feel to it and to the city. And perhaps you could argue the Roman remains could be a bit better presented. The bathhouses are kind of sat at the edge of a field which you can walk over to and I think quite easily miss. But I suppose they are at least accessible and free to see. While it said the Roman legacy may be limited in respect of the buildings, it does actually remain in the city's streetscape today, with Penny Street and Church Streets today following the route still of the original Roman roads on which Lancaster was founded. So I think there's some interesting stuff, things you can still see today which reflect that. So it's going to be a reasonable score for me. I think I'm going to give it a 4.5.
The big legacy of Lancaster maybe is more in the name. There is interesting political history there. There's interesting military history, the Scottish battles that you've mentioned. So I will be giving it a 5. Our next category, culture, explores major cultural scenes and influences of the city we visit, normally in art, music, literature, but also sometimes we find historical events in a city that leave a cultural legacy. So therefore, let's start by talking about the Pendle Witch trials.
Yeah, we're starting with something a little bit different for Lancaster. The Pendle Witch trials happened in 1612 and probably the most famous witch trials in the history of England, where 20 people, 4 men and 16 women, were tried at Lancaster Castle, mostly, as you'd expect, for witchcraft. And we're including it in this category because it really is part of local, if not national, folklore, and because it's had a really deep cultural and artistic legacy all the way up to today. The trials were extremely well documented in court notes, which were kept, which you can actually access online and read today. So we have a real insight into what happened at the trials. I think it's probably helpful to give a bit of broader social context to the trials before we get into the detail of them. They occurred in 1612, shortly after the Gunpowder Plot. So there was this real prevailing paranoia in the country about plot and conspiracy, including about witchcraft. King James I, who was the intended target of the Gunpowder Plot, was personally captivated by witchcraft, the idea of it, even writing a book about witchcraft, which some historians have seen as, in a pretty informal way, effectively giving license to the whole country to start pursuing witches for legal trial. The hysteria might have been slightly overblown by modern interpretation, as fewer than 500 people were ever executed for witchcraft in England, and many were actually acquitted, contrary to the popular idea of these trials, but it certainly lives on in the popular imagination today. And to get on to the detail of the trial, of the 20 people who were tried, 1 died mid-trial, 8 were found not guilty, 10 were hanged, very important, not burned, hanged. And if you look at the numbers, those 10 actually constituted 2% of that total 500 who were ever executed for witchcraft in England. And one of them was sentenced to the stocks. And there was an important legal precedent that came out of the trials as well. Before the Pendle Witch trials, no one under the age of 14 was allowed to give evidence in an English trial. But a 9-year-old girl, Janet Device, gave evidence which led to the executions, including of her entire family. Reference was actually made to a line in that book by James I. Children, women and liars can be witnesses over high treason against God, which sounds very galling to our modern ears, but at the time was seen as a reason why a child could give evidence in this case for the first time. And the story of the trials is that this girl, Janet's older sister, Alison, put a curse on a peddler for not giving her any pins. The peddler then collapsed, and Alison confessed the bewitching, but also accused several of her neighbours of the same crime. And so after this, several others ended up facing the same accusation, including some Catholics, which again is unsurprising given that prevailing political context of anti-Catholic prejudice after the Gunpowder Plot. And as well as the English legal precedent regarding child witnesses, the trials also had an influence on the American justice system, because this detailed written record of the trials spread to America, and it led to the allowing of testimony of children in witchcraft trials there, including at the infamous Salem witch trials in 1692. And it's been depicted in many books, imagine works of fiction. Really, it's had a huge influence in the popular imagination today when it comes to witchcraft.
You know, you mentioned Salem. If you go to Salem in Massachusetts, it's full of the sort of shops that you like trying to build a tourism industry from the story of witchcraft. That isn't really the case in Lancaster, as far as I could tell.
Well, you do have a couple of things. You do have it is quite small, exhibition at the castle, which we saw on the Pendle Witch.
Well, that was excellent.
It's just one room, but you can go in. There's some local modern art which has contributed to it. Also, I think one of the local buses is called the Pendle Witch or something on those lines. So there's been a bit of an effort in to recognise it. But modern interpretations, various novels since the 18th century, poems. I think even the inspiration for some of Terry Pratchett's witch characters were the names of some of the people who stood trial. So it's had a lasting influence today.
Pendle witch trials are well known. We're exploring sort of other areas of sort of cultural legacy in Lancaster. There's not a huge amount. I think it's fair to say Lancaster's got a lot of sort of cultural institutions and festivals and a lot going on, but there's not so many that sort of have exported from the city. Do you want to touch on some of the culture that we did find?
One thing I think we can talk about is the annual music festival in October, because it is a modern development. You're right. It's kind of a modern cultural and artistic institution rather than itself being a historical one. But what it does do is make use of some of the city's oldest and most interesting buildings as stages. So we'll speak more about some of these venues in the later categories, but in the 2021 festival, they used a stage within the refurbished internal courtyard terrace area of the castle. They used the Priory Church next door. They used the music room pavilion, which is a fantastic building we'll talk more about later. They used Dalton Square in front of the new town hall. Lots of other Georgian buildings for which Lancaster is famous, including various pubs and bookshops. So, yes, it's a secondary link, if you like, rather than a primary one to cultural history. But there is clearly some effort to incorporate the city's heritage into its modern art scene.
I think as well the university has been a driving force of culture in the city. The Lancaster Arts at Lancaster University, I mean, the campus for the university is actually outside of the main core of the city, just to the south, but there are some important venues associated with the university: art gallery, the Peter Scott Gallery, and on the campus, links to the Wakefield episode, there's a Barbara Hepworth sculpture, dual form, on the campus.
Oh, excellent.
So, all right then, well, let's go on to the scores. And I found the Pendle Witch trials information really interesting, and I think it was well presented at the castle. I think Lancaster's quite an interesting place to visit for culture. There's a couple of good theatres there, the Grand Theatre, but there's not a huge amount that's left the city. So for me, it's going to be a 3.
As we've touched on, there is a reasonably thriving art scene in the town today. There are numerous arts festivals, concerts and plays, and I think Lancaster can pretty justifiably call itself a cultural city. But the question we have to ask is, how does this relate to Lancaster's history, and what has Lancaster given to the world around it? And I think related to this, there's a great quote from a local council report, which is that Lancaster's history is written in its streets and its buildings, and they utilise these well for the music festival and its various other arts festivals. But it honestly hasn't exactly given much to the world beyond the lore of the Pendle Witches, and I suppose being sandwiched in between Liverpool and Manchester probably hasn't helped in recent times. It's really noticeable how little reference there was to art and culture in the City Museum. That was much more about industry and trade. It's fair to say that the city is at least making some effort to make the most of its assets in the music festival. It's a real shame that the old Maritime Festival doesn't exist anymore, because, as we'll come on to talk about, the quayside around the old port area of Lancaster is one of its greatest assets today in respect of its urban heritage. So overall, I think there's stuff to do, there's stuff to see. It's a cultural city, but not so much that it's given to the world, really. So for me, it's going to be a 2.5.
Very good. And I'd say there's nice beer in Lancaster.
Absolutely.
There's nice beer everywhere.
No, there's some good pubs there.
Our next category is science and industry. And here we're going to start off talking about Lancaster's history as an international trading centre.
Yeah, because Lancaster's modern wealth and much of its urban fabric today is built on its heritage as a trading port, because Lancaster became wealthy in the 18th century as one of the biggest ports in the country. It was one of a number of West Coast English ports trading with Ireland, but it also traded extensively with the Americas, the American and West Indian colonies of the British Empire. And the reasons for this primarily lie in Lancaster's geography. Lancaster sits on a wide river that runs just a few miles into the west coast. I think Morecambe Bay is only about 3 miles away as the crow flies.
Yeah. And
the town had a port since Roman times, but this, like the town, had actually fallen into disrepair by the 18th century. Daniel Defoe said of the town that it had little to recommend it but a decayed castle and a more decayed port, which really paints you a proper picture there. But following this, there was extensive work done to St George's Quay, which is just to the northwest of the city centre in the 1750s. And this work was what allowed the port and the town to grow and rise to prominence through trade with the British Empire from the 19th century onwards. The construction work included the construction of the Custom House, which now holds the Maritime Museum, which we visited, and I think does a really good job of exploring Lancaster's trading history, and is definitely a good way to spend a couple of hours.
Superb museum. So I would say if you're visiting Lancaster, do walk over to St George's Quay, because it's got a stunning collection of buildings, and you've got this museum. It's got a lot of content for a small museum. There's a lot in there, but the main area that the main thing to understand, I think, and I think the museum covers this well, is that period in British history when Lancaster was one of the largest ports. Was it the fourth largest, I think, port in England, which is incredible to think now. But
it did fall into disuse again fairly quickly, unfortunately, as we saw in our Chester episode. The silting of the River Lune and competition from Liverpool, those two twin factors, caused its decline. And eventually there was a new port built further up out by Glasson Dock, which meant there was no need for boats to sail up the Lune into Lancaster. There was still some coasting trade noted in the town in the 1860s, so trade did continue for a time, but on a smaller scale.
But clearly the port has been superseded. It's important to talk about the nature of the trade and how the wealth was built up in Lancaster, because I think this is well told, both in the museums and the slavery trail. But of course, this was riches made off the triangle trade, which was the international trade of exports from Britain to West Africa, slaves from West Africa to the United States and the Caribbean, and then raw materials such as sugar and tobacco and rum, Britain. That's well told, I think, in the museums. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I think we need to give the context on what this means for Lancaster, because there's definitely a darker side to this, which is that as well as trading in those goods you mentioned, sugar, other material goods, tradesmen, merchants in Lancaster also traded in people. And at one point, Lancaster was the fourth biggest slave trading port in the country.
Wow.
In the 7 decades up to 1807, 180 ships and nearly 30,000 slaves were transported from Lancaster. But of course, much more than that, many of the goods that were traded through the port were themselves produced by slave labour or for slave plantations. The local Rawlinson family was at the head of the exploitation of slave labour in Lancaster. There's a monument to the family which dates in the 18th century outside Lancaster Priory Church, which, as you might expect, has met with some hostility, particularly in recent times. And the home built by John Rawlinson at 2-6 High Street in Lancaster is a very impressive Georgian home, though you'd have to say its grandeur would be tainted in the eyes of many by how its construction was funded. And the same can be said for various other houses which were owned by slave owners, such as 20 Castle Park, which was owned by the Satterthwaite family. As for what you can see today, there have been some attempts to recognise this today. You can explore some of the physical legacy of slavery in Lancaster, as well as following the Lancaster Slave Trade, Abolition and Fair Trade trail, which you can download from the Visit Lancaster website. There is a permanent memorial to victims of slavery called Captured Africans on St George's Quay, and it is brought up in the Maritime Museum. I think there was a recognition there that they need to do more, and they're in the process of changing how they present the legacy of Lancaster's trade today. They at least have acknowledged this and said there is an ongoing process to document this better.
I think that's right. And I understand that the Judges' Lodgings Museum, which we couldn't get to because it was closed at the time. It's reopening late March. I gather they've got funding for a new project to explore the history of the city and slavery. So hopefully more to follow. But I thought the trail was very good, and I think if you're visiting, that would be a great way to see the city and understand the associations between those buildings that you see and this barbaric trade. And it does explore the bulk of the interesting buildings of the city. It covers St George's Quay, the Quakers Meeting House, the Castle, Maritime Museum, the memorial that you've mentioned went in 2005, and an old bench which is associated with the cotton famine, the 1860s, which we'll cover in a later episode, I'm sure. Shall we talk about some other industries to come out of Lancaster? It was famous for furniture making.
It did, as you say, become fairly famous for furniture making in the 18th century, using mahogany, which was imported directly to Lancaster. Furniture production continued in the city until the 1960s, and there's a good collection of furniture in the Judges' Lodgings Museum, which, as you mentioned, is reopening very soon. We can also talk in more modern times about Reebok, because Lancaster later housed the European headquarters of Reebok, which was founded in nearby Bolton, and stayed in the town until fairly recently in 2006. And Reebok actually sponsored the local non-league football team Lancaster City for a while in the 90s and 2000s. So it's a pretty major, I think you could probably say easily a household brand that had a major hub in Lancaster.
No, absolutely. Well worth mentioning. And in this section, we like to talk about individuals who have made scientific accomplishments. And for Lancaster, we've got the paleontologist Richard Owen.
Yeah, this is a fun one. Richard Owen, a famous Victorian paleontologist, came up with the word dinosaur.
Unbelievable.
And as well as that, on a more practical level, campaigned for the opening of the Natural History Museum in London in 1881. Richard's connection to Lancaster was that he was born, he lived and was educated in Lancaster at Lancaster Royal Grammar School. To delve a bit more deeply into his scientific achievements, he actually was the first to propose that dinosaurs were a separate group within the ranks of animal taxonomy. So some have described him before as, in a loose sense, the father of all dinosaurs for that reason. But he wasn't an uncontroversial figure. He did make a lot of errors. He actually provided the scientific instructions for the famous Crystal Palace dinosaurs in London. These are famously heavily outdated representations of dinosaurs, but they were fairly, to some extent, outdated at the time. There was research by others that showed that some dinosaurs, such as iguanodons, stood on 2 feet rather than 4, and they didn't, not lumbering around on 4 legs. But no, Richard Owen stuck to his guns and designed iguanodon to be this kind of lumbering creature which you see in the Crystal Palace dinosaurs.
We've got some silly-looking dinosaurs in South London as a result.
Thanks to Lancaster.
But he did give us the Natural History Museum, which more than makes up for it. Okay, then, should we go on to the scoring?
I think it's fair to say Lancaster industrially has never been a major powerhouse. That's reflected in its stagnating Victorian population that we mentioned earlier. But there are some points of note here, and that's not least the significance of its port and how so many of the important mid-18th century buildings from this survive today around St George's Quay, which gives us quite a good physical memento of this industry. We have focused quite a bit on the slave trade in this section, and I suppose I have to recognise it might feel somewhat crass to start awarding points when we're talking about such a subject. But I'll probably have to set out that we're not making qualitative moral judgments with these scores. But for this, we'd probably be looking more at how this is recognised in Lancaster today. And I think it's fair to say that an effort has been and is being made in the Captured Africans Memorial, in the Slave Trade, Abolition and Fair Trade Trail, and in research into the houses and other public and private buildings which were built through the proceeds of slavery. For the coverage in the Maritime Museum, I think it probably gives a tad more weight to the exploiters of slave labour than would be desirable, and certainly more than to the victims of their labour. They are committing to change this in the future. So I think it'll be really interesting to go back and see how they fulfil that in the future. Overall, I think we've had quite a lot to talk about, quite a lot of research, good presentation in such a small city. So for me, it's going to be a decent score. I think I'm going to give it a 6.
So this is arguably the first city we've visited on the podcast where there's a clear and direct line between the horrors of slavery and exploitation and the story of the growth of the city. And we've covered a number of medieval and even Roman towns which sort of predated the mercantile or colonial Britain. Yet this topic will re-emerge when we visit other mill towns, maritime towns. We'll definitely see this when we go to, Bristol, Liverpool, Bolton, Rochdale, all the cities that grew wealthy from exploitation one way or another. It's going to be part of the story. And I think it's an important element of a city's history to explore this and to, even if it's unpleasant, even if it's deeply unpleasant, it's important to explore it. And I think Lancaster, its Maritime Museum and its City Museum and the trail that we've discussed start to do this, and I think they do it well. For someone who's interested in history and how things come to be, these lessons are important. We need to learn, and there are analogous contemporary issues, climate justice being an example, and perhaps a renewed appreciation of the connection between wealth and ostentatious displays of wealth and in architectural form and the suffering that it's built off is an important lesson. So I think it's good, and Lancaster is narrating and contributing to this. I was really surprised by all this history. I didn't know much about it in terms of Lancaster. I didn't know Lancaster was such an important port, and it was so pivotal to this period of our history. For me, alongside furniture making, alongside Richard Owen, I think there's stuff to talk about here. So for me, it's going to be a 7. Our next category explores the urban landscape of Lancaster. And what strikes you when you arrive in this city is a relatively coherent colours and hues of buildings, building materials stretching over hilly terrain, but then punctuated by some large standout remarkable buildings. And the most remarkable of all is Lancaster Castle.
Lancaster Castle really is, I think, Lancaster's architectural jewel. One of the first things you notice, one of the first things you think of when you think of how Lancaster looks today. For a brief history of the building itself, the first castle on the site was built in the 11th century, but the current building was started in the 12th century. As we touched on earlier, it was damaged extensively in several military conflicts, in Robert the Bruce's Scottish raids, and later in the Civil War. But in construction terms, it did survive these things, and it was later actually strengthened after the Scottish raids by John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and extended in the 16th century, possibly as a defence against the Spanish Armada. It's been visited by numerous monarchs since it was constructed, but it was later extensively rebuilt in the 18th and 19th centuries. This rebuilding included the entire north side of the castle, and it was completely repurposed at this point as a shire hall and a jail. And the castle has continued in this function as courts and a jail right into modern times. Prisoners were held in the jail there until 2011, and even today it's the oldest courtroom in Britain still in use. And according to one source I found, it holds the British record for the most death sentences in total handed out. The court and the jail being together on the same site actually gave it a good specific function in various times. Notably, during the trial of the Birmingham Six, the 6 Irishmen who were wrongly convicted of a 1975 IRA bombing of a pub in Birmingham, because having both these facilities on the same site meant that the accused could be held and tried in the same place, which was a much more secure way of holding the trial rather than risk them being sprung. My personal favourite part of the castle today is the gatehouse where you enter. This dates from around 1400, and I like it because, as well as being a grand and very old entrance in itself, it has on its side a very imposing reminder of the prison rules for visitors on a big sign as you go in. If you remember, Liam, it had on there all the penalties for smuggling in contraband, like £500 fine or whatever it was, or helping prisoners to escape, which was quite a lot of years in prison. And today you can visit the courtyard of the castle inside, which has, I think, been recently refurbished, and a few areas inside. There's a small exhibition on the Pendle Witches, which we talked about. To see more of the castle, you have to go on a guided tour, though. This lets you see about a third of the buildings. But what you can see is still affected by the court activities today, because it is still a working building in that respect.
What I liked about this castle as well is its general setting. It's on the hill, so it sort of dominates. You can see it from a long way around. But it's got quite a tight courtyard. It's quite an interesting set of buildings. It feels like a big castle that's kind of been squidged together. So it's quite different from, for example, where we were last time in Lincoln, where you've got a lot of space. But like Lincoln, you can just wander into the courtyard, totally free of charge, and admire the building. Next to the castle, on the hill,
the Priory Church. That's actually built along with the castle on the site of the Roman fort, and later a Saxon church on the same site. Actually, a Roman wall has been excavated beneath the area around the altar in the church. And it actually has one of the few Saxon remnants left in the whole of North Lancashire, which is a doorway in the west wall of the nave, which is the main central part of the church. The current church was built in the 15th century in the perpendicular Gothic style, which is something we covered a lot in the Bath episode, I think. Yeah. And Nicholas Pevsner, the famous architectural historian, calls it the most outstanding example of perpendicular Gothic architecture in its entire region. As we talked about in that Bath episode, perpendicular Gothic was the last kind of original, by which I mean pre-revival, movement of Gothic architecture in England, and actually quite a regressive style, because there were already neoclassical styles being utilised heavily on the continent. It was very much a kind of almost parochial British style at the time. But what has left us is a really nice church today in a great location on top of the hill from which you can get fantastic views. And actually inside the church, one of the most notable features is the choir stalls and the misericords, which is a fantastic word. This is the undersides of the foldable seats in the choir stalls. These are really notable for their architectural ornateness. So nice little church to wander around today.
Absolutely. And as you say, it's a good collection of buildings on top of the hill. So if you are visiting, it's a great way to start your visit. And there's sweeping views over to Morecambe Bay as well. Then coming down from the hill, you have the great view, if you look in the opposite direction from Morecambe Bay, a view back towards the city. And what really strikes you is the uniformity of the architecture. And this brings us on to the incredible Georgian architecture that we see in Lancaster today.
There's really loads of that survives in Lancaster, and this is really an overarching theme that strikes you when you're in the town. It's been described, perhaps aspirationally, as the Bath of the North for this reason, and much of the yellow gritstone that gives the buildings of Lancaster their distinct yellow hue gives it perhaps a similar air of uniformity, though maybe less strikingly or homogeneously than you see in Bath. This might be slightly surprising, because you might instinctively think of Lancaster as being medieval in its heritage rather than Georgian, but actually, aside from the castle and priory, there's really nothing medieval left in the city. And that's due in part to a post-medieval decline in the town's fortunes, which we saw earlier in what Defoe said about the town. It became far less intensely urbanised by the 17th century. One early 17th century writer said, "The town at this day is not very well peopled, nor much frequented, and all the inhabitants therefore are given to husbandry." While Celia Fiennes, another travel writer, was complimentary about the castle, but described the town as old and much decayed. And this is important, because what it meant was the city was absolutely ripe for redevelopment, which happened as a result of the increased wealth we saw due to the colonial trade, both directly with new port facilities such as the Custom House and indirectly through new houses and other buildings built by wealthy merchants and industrialists. Arthur Young, another travel writer, captured this very well in 1770. He said, "It's a town increasing in buildings, having many new piles, much superior to the old." And some of the buildings you might see today, there are many of them, but some that stand out are the Assembly Rooms, the Old Town Hall, St John's Church, and all around Dalton Square, which was set out by John Dalton in the 1780s, who named all the streets after his relatives. The new town hall that he constructed there, and the Queen Victoria statue right in the middle of Dalton Square, which has on its friezes at the bottom a few dozen notable Victorian figures, many of which you would know today. And if I could pick out one personal favourite Georgian building, I think that would be the music room. And the music room was built around the 1730s as a garden pavilion. It's a notably tall and thin building, and it's a bit of a misnomer actually, the music room, because it was probably never designed for music. The best guess is that the name's kind of a mistaken interpretation of Muse's room, as the plasterwork inside the building shows the 9 muses of antiquity. And it is this amazing plasterwork which is really exceptional. It's in the stucco style, which is where you make a kind of cement plaster and use it as a decorative moulding. I've heard it described as being like making a very ornately decorated wedding cake from the inside. Nicholas Pevsner again described the plasterwork in 1969 as gorgeous but beyond repair, because the building was in such a poor condition at the time. But fortunately, he was completely wrong, and 6,000 hours of work went into the building's restoration in the 1970s. And today, you can stay in the building, and there's an excellent coffee shop downstairs with beans that are roasted just in the next street. So if you like your coffee, if you like staying in interesting buildings, the music rooms are an excellent place to check out.
Particularly useful if you're getting to a city very early in the morning to research a podcast. We do enjoy a good coffee on Ye Olde Guide. But I think what you've touched on there, you mentioned that although the city streets of Lancaster have most of them feel like they've got a medieval structure. There is this overriding Georgian architecture, and that's where it is, I think, a bit different from Bath, because in Bath you have those large urban extensions that were very much in a Georgian form. There's less of that in Lancaster, Dalton Square being the exception. It creates quite a beautiful scene as it sort of sweeps up the hill with the capping of the hills with the castle, and on the opposite hill, the Ashton Memorial, which we absolutely have to discuss.
The Ashton Memorial is, to put it slightly dryly, a Grade 1 listed Victorian folly in Williamson Park, which is a short walk from the city centre. It was built in 1909 by Lord Ashton, James Williamson, where the name of the park comes from, who was a local millionaire business owner who was educated at the Royal Grammar School in Lancaster, MP for Lancaster, and son of a mayor of the city, so a real local boy, in memory of his wife Jessie. The park, as a small side note, this is quite interesting. Williamson Park was created from old stone quarries, and it's from there that much of the building material, that yellow gritstone that remains in Lancaster's building of that era was mined, kind of torn directly from the earth that surrounded Lancaster. But it's hard to do the Ashton Memorial justice, because it really is vast. It's the highest point in Lancaster. It's 50 metres tall at the top of a hill, and Pevsner described it as the grandest monument in England. And it's an incredible sight when you're there. It's built from white Portland stone in the Edwardian Baroque style. The Edwardian Baroque is a neoclassical design style, which it was kind of a revival of that ornate English Baroque style that we've discussed in previous episodes, but defined by its era. Quite obviously, it came about in the Edwardian era, as well as its style, which was a tad less ornate, a bit lighter in colour, and often characterised by domed towers more than the original English Baroque style. Now, Lord Ashton also created other buildings in Lancaster. He had a town hall built on Dalton Square, quite notably, and also in 1909 the very dramatic, although admittedly dilapidated, Queen Victoria Memorial, which sits in the middle of the square and depicts about 50 famous Victorian public figures from various walks of life on its frieze. So the Ashton Memorial is definitely the most striking example of his legacy in the town, but there are others that you can see.
I mean, the town hall is massive as well. I mean, it's a very impressive building. But I agree. I think when you travel through Lancaster, you come through on the train, the Ashton Memorial is what you see. It towers over because it's on a hill and just because it's very tall itself, and it's a very striking building. And I think if you are visiting Lancaster, I think it's a must to go through Williamson Park, very pleasant park, and climb up to the memorial. It's a very pleasant walk, and again, excellent views back over Lancaster, the castle, and beyond. And I think you said it reminded you of the Sacre-Cœur.
Oh, it does actually, yeah. On a miniature scale, when you're sitting at the bottom of the steps looking up to the memorial, I think you can get that impression.
Right, well, are we ready to do the scores?
I think so.
It's going to be a good score for me. We've discussed some of the excellent, outstanding architectural features of the city, particularly the Georgian architecture, but also some standout buildings like the castle, the Ashton Memorial. I thought it was a really well laid out, beautiful city, and I just loved the topography. I loved the hills, the views. I thought the river the Lune was very nice, the quayside, and the bridges over it, and the compact city centre. So for me, it's an 8.
Wow, that's Lancaster's highest score in any category so far. It's doing well. I agree that this is a very strong category for Lancaster, really because the city as a whole feels distinctive. I'd actually say it has, in some ways, more the feel of a small Scottish town than an English town, which I definitely mean as a compliment, because in the way that much of the city, not all, but a great deal of it, escaped this ugly post-war redevelopment we see in so many English town and city centres today, and it retains many of its older grand and civic buildings. And so many other towns, the only old buildings left alone were a few scattered remnants and churches. But here, the public and private Georgian construction is absolutely integral to Lancaster's urban character. The castle is wonderful, even if much of it's a modern restoration. That doesn't, I think, detract from its beauty at all. And it's had a really strong influence on later developments in Lancaster. If you arrive by train, take a look at the battlements on the station building as you arrive, for an example. I think that particular station used to actually be called Lancaster Castle when Lancaster had multiple stations. One thing I will say, though, is that you don't really get all that much out of the castle when you're there as a visitor, apart from the visual aesthetics. It could be a real heritage centrepiece of Lancaster, but despite there having been suggestions over the years to open it more to the public, the bulk of it is still closed or accessible by tour only. Its use is basically constrained really by the whims of the court service and its owner, the Duchy of Lancaster, as well as available finance, because as lovely as it would be to think it will attract visitors, in many cases, if you build it, they will come, hasn't worked for major new heritage attractions in this country. But it's unfortunate it's carried on even though the prison has been closed and offered new opportunities for renovation and representation. I suppose the irony here really is that having a function in this way probably assisted with the castle's preservation, as too often in modern industrial Britain, urban artefacts that didn't have a function, like city walls and battlements, were demolished. So there's kind of a tension between the constraints of the court service and the jail that they've been placed on the use of the castle as a heritage attraction, and the fact they've helped to preserve the castle for this long. But overall, I think if you want something distinctive, something unique, something just interesting to walk around and see, I think you'd be hard pressed to find better in a town or city of Lancaster's size. So it's definitely a good score for me as well. It's a 7.5.
Well, that's a very good score. Our final category is reality versus expectations, where we reflect overall on how much we've enjoyed visiting the city and how it compares to its reputation.
From the outset, I'm going to answer the question you asked me at the beginning and say, yes, I had a lot of fun in Lancaster. It's a lovely city, and I would definitely suggest it for a visit to anyone. And it's got a really deep and interesting history that belies its small size. In this particular category, I think Lancaster's greatest potential lies in its built heritage. So that's what I'm going to concentrate on here. It's a compact, manageable city with plenty of old buildings ripe for repurposing. There's plenty of potential, but it's probably fair to say it isn't quite in the Premier League of historic towns. And one question Lancaster's been grappling with in recent times is, how does it get into that Premier League? Interestingly, what we have is a local heritage strategy report for the council, which was prepared in 2011, which gives us a lot of proposed answers to this and really some kind of almost self-assessed parameters through which, 11 years on, we can judge Lancaster's presentation against its aims. The report shows that Lancaster knows its strength lies in its landscapes. It says Lancaster's greatest economic value of its heritage derives from the attractiveness of its landscapes, but concedes it has a low profile. It's not on the radar as a choice for a visit or break. And the report does suggest redevelopment of the castle as a major tourist attraction to make it the centrepiece of the city. Unfortunately, looking 11 years on, very, very little has come of this. There was some internal conservation and restoration work done. There was a new terrace inside, a new cafe put in. You can't really do very much in the castle. There's been no major museum extension as was proposed. And I think you could also say the same with the historic waterfront around St George's Quay, around where the port was. The report, again for the council, notes how it distinctly lacks bustle. The Maritime Museum down there is good, but a tad hidden away and isolated on what is today a pretty quiet riverside. I think you could compare this with historic waterfront development in other towns, like in, say, our hometown, Ipswich, which had a less important port historically, but the old buildings and repurposing of the industrial fabric look great. They've been utilised in a really effective way, and there's just lots of life in the area that wasn't there before. I mean, for one thing, boats actually use it. There's not a single boat that goes up the Lune anymore. So I think my score here is tempered a bit by the fact that Lancaster has so much more potential, given the historical resonance of its name. But this is reality versus expectations, and the point of this report really is that expectations are not all that high in the first place. And I'll say, again, I had a lot of fun in Lancaster. While it has failed, I think, to achieve its aims in representing itself as a heritage town, it's still a lovely little city with a really deep and interesting history that belies that small size. So I am still going to give it a positive score. I'm going to give it a 6.5.
Do you think that on that sort of waterfront point, I just wonder whether that's because Lancaster didn't need that sort of waterfront-led regeneration that other towns and cities needed?
Well, interestingly, the report did have a kind of cost-benefit analysis, a fairly crude one at the back, and it decided that redevelopment of the waterfront would be very low in benefit because it's outside the city centre. It didn't feel like a redevelopment of the waterfront would attract the heritage visitors that, say, a redevelopment of the castle would. And that's why, if there is funding to be had, you'd have to think that that's where it would go, with the castle being its major heritage asset. Yeah,
I think that's right. I think when people want to enjoy themselves in Lancaster, it's already got such a nice, compact city centre. It feels like you're going to struggle to draw people away. But maybe that's good. I mean, maybe it's good to have a sort of a quiet dockside to appreciate the history. But yeah, really interesting. It's reality versus expectations. Look, in my mind, before visiting, I imagined Lancaster would be a pleasant but perhaps small place without much to see. But I had completely missed the enormous role and enormous history of maritime trade of Lancaster. I didn't realise it was the fourth or fifth busiest port in the 18th century, and the significance of Lancaster in the triangle trade, including building slave ships. And I think this was told well in the museums and the trail. Lancaster has a decent set of museums. There's not one massive standout museum, but there's a collection of museums. The Maritime Museum, the City Hall, the Cottage Museum are soon to reopen Judges' Lodgings. Means together there's actually plenty to see there. There's variety. And then you've got those architectural gems of the castle and the Ashton Memorial. So I think there's a lot to see. As a place to visit, I would note its sort of proximity to the coast, to Morecambe, as I mentioned earlier, to the Lake District. It's not far to Windermere. It's a good place to visit, not just for the city itself, but for its surroundings. So I think it makes an excellent trip, and I also had a great time. So it did exceed my expectations. So for me, it's a 7.
So that's a 13.5 overall. And again, to emphasise, 5 is our starting point. So any town that achieves a positive score above 10 in reality versus expectations is doing very well. So overall, that's 9.5 out of 20 for political and military influence, politics and war, as we shorten it to, 5.5 for art and culture, 13 for science and industry, 15.5 for urban landscape, and 13.5 for reality versus expectations. So that puts Lancaster on 57 overall. And if I look at the league table, that puts it, I think, actually right in the middle.
Mid-table.
Right in the middle.
But that's all we've got time for. Please do get in touch with us via the website, yeoldeguide.com. Please leave any comments you have on the website. Tell us what we've missed. Did we get these scores right? Have you been to Lancaster? What did you think? We would really appreciate it if you've enjoyed the podcast to leave a rating and review at Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and hit the subscribe button. It pushes the podcast up the ranks so more people can hear it. And please tune in again for our next episode. Where are we heading to next, Daniel?
We have a couple of places lined up. Our next trip is going to be slightly further south, over towards the Welsh border. We're off to Shropshire to visit Shrewsbury.
The attentive listener will have noticed a correlation between the Ipswich Town's away fixture list and the places we visit. So yes, the next episode will indeed be Shrewsbury. I can't wait. See you next time.
And bye from me.
Bye.